The Ice Age series is perhaps one of the most infamous examples of a franchise that just would not end, to the point that it only stopped once audiences finally had enough of just how stupid it had become. Now, I already did a video exploring where the series went wrong, and you can find a link in the description to it. But today I'd like to go much more in depth as to what exactly went wrong with the franchise, considering how strong it actually started out. And there will be spoilers ahead for pretty much every movie in the series. So in case you aren't entirely caught up and don't want something ruined, I would highly recommend not proceeding with this video. You have been warned. Okay, so in the aforementioned video I made, the conclusion I came to was basically that the series started getting way too outlandish, and that, combined with bad writing, made their final installment terrible at a time when it needed to be exceptional if they wanted it to continue. And that definitely does have a lot to do with it, especially considering the series started off relatively grounded, and by the end they're battling dinosaurs, asteroids, and Scrat is flying around in a spaceship. It's so ridiculous that even a 5-year-old would find it stupid, which was a major reason why Collision Course flopped, and they finally pulled the plug on the franchise. But that being said, those two things alone aren't to blame for the decline of the Ice Age series, because I was only covering the basics in that video, and those were two of the biggest contributing factors to it, so I mainly stuck to those aspects when discussing it. But there were other, more subtle reasons the Ice Age series started declining with each passing installment. And just one of them is the fact that there's very little interconnectivity between the movies. I mean, in the first movie we see how Manny, Sid, and Diego become a herd. In the sequel we see how they meet Ellie and her brothers. In the third one we see how Peaches is born and the herd's bond becomes stronger than ever. In the fourth we see the lengths Manny will go to for his new family. And in the fifth one we get to see Peaches start her own family and the herd trying to stay together for the long haul. So there is definitely something of an overarching story here. But the problem is that, apart from that very basic outline I just gave, the story behind every movie is very contained and doesn't contribute much to an overall story. Like, for example, in the first movie we see that Manny is an unpleasant grouch because he lost his family to a group of hunters, and how the events of the movie finally give him back his will to live. But this isn't really followed up on in the sequels as much as it could have been. Sure, his getting together with Ellie in the sequel has shades of him continuing what he learned in the previous movie and trying to start a new family, but the narrative frames it more as him worried that his species is going extinct, and he feels it's his responsibility to have children. And honestly, though not done badly, the whole thing could have had a lot more emotional weight behind it if what happened to his previous family had more central focus or was even mentioned at all. And the same goes even more so in Continental Drift, where his overprotectiveness of Peaches and his determination to get back to his family could have meant a lot more if it was made clearer he's desperate to save his family from the same fate as his previous one, giving him a story similar to Marlin in Finding Nemo. Now, it can be inferred that that's why he behaves the way he does, but especially if you've never seen the original Ice Age movie, he simply comes across as a stereotypical overprotective father, when there was room for a much more emotional story at its core that could have also tied back to the previous films. And the same goes for Sid here as well. Because in the original movie, we see that his family abandoned him because they found him to be nothing but an annoying nuisance. But by the end, he's found a new family that accepts him for who he is. And while there is also some follow-up to this, particularly in the third one when his fear of the herd splitting up drives him to try and adopt the 3 dinosaur babies, there was still potential to do more with it. Particularly in the fourth movie, when he stumbles onto his family again. That could have made for a great side plot, where Sid wonders who his true family is, considering that the herd treats him as an equal, while his family just up and left him simply because he's a goof. But this potentially interesting plot is wasted when they just dump his grandma with him and then take off again, leaving very little room for that plot point to go anywhere. And that's not even getting into other interesting things they could have done regarding his character. And finally, and perhaps most notably, there's Diego. Because unlike Manny and Sid, whose stories from the first movie do at least somewhat continue in the sequels, Diego's story goes pretty much nowhere once the first movie ends, to the point that the writers seem desperate to find a subplot for him in each passing movie so that his presence doesn't feel entirely wasted and useless. And this basically amounts to him having a fear of water in the second movie, him having insecurities about his hunting problems in the third, and getting his own love interest in the fourth and fifth. Now, some might argue that this can be down to the fact that he was originally supposed to die in the original movie, and thus his story wasn't meant to continue, unlike Manny and Sid. But considering he did ultimately survive, they should have just owned it and taken his story in a logical direction. Specifically how he adjusts to actually having friends and how it compares to him living with a pack where what the leader says goes. In other words, they should have built off the lessons he learned in the first movie and see him become extremely devoted to the herd because they showed him kindness and treated him as an equal where his pack never did. Similar to Sid, only played more seriously. But they didn't do any of that. And the only time this is really brought up at all is in Continental Drift, when he tells Shira that he chose to leave his pack and how the herd actually looks out for each other instead of using each other as tools. And while it's a good callback to the first movie and the lesson he learned, that really should have been a much bigger focus of his character throughout the movies. Basically, rather than expanding on the story and plot points set up by the first movie, the Ice Age sequels started quickly focusing on gimmicks as their setup. Like, now the characters have to face the Ice Age ending, which isn't really out of the realm of possibility, and thus why that one is probably considered the best. But then, as I noted at the start, things quickly got ridiculous. Them ending up in a world of dinosaurs, having the continents separate on them, and then having to deal with pirates, and then an asteroid brought on by Scrat flying a UFO, threatening Earth with extinction. To put it simply, none of this helps build on the story of the first movie, and is simply there to try and keep the story interesting, no matter how much it doesn't fit. Now, sure, a series like this isn't exactly supposed to tell a big story over one overarching narrative, so the individual installments should be able to stand on their own merits and story. But at least some interconnectivity between the movie's stories would have been nice, even if it wasn't the main focus. I mean, Just take a look at a franchise like Toy Story, and specifically how the first three movies were able to continue to tell the story of the first while also telling their own individual stories at the same time. That's what Ice Age should have done rather than rely on cheap gimmicks. And this problem was only compounded by how many new characters were added to the films with each passing installment. Because as I got into in a separate video, which you can also find a link in the description to, adding a bunch of new characters to an established franchise is often a pretty big sign that the series is going downhill. And while the addition of Ellie and her brothers is a logical one in the sequel, as once again it adds to Manny's story and it makes sense that they would meet new faces, after that they started being added unnecessarily. Really, Buck was pretty much the only good new character to come after that, as once again, a wild adventurer who's seen it all is a pretty logical addition. But other than that, pretty much every new character was either badly written or unnecessary, to the point that once Collision Course came around, there were so many characters involved that it's hard to keep track of them, and some of the more important characters don't get enough focus as a result. To put it simply, the way they started adding new characters to the series is honestly a textbook example of how not to do it. Because all they end up doing is taking over the narrative without adding anything to it, as well as take the spotlight away from the older, more significant characters. And those are just a few of the ways that a series as good as the original Ice Age can become as bad as Ice Age Collision Course. Because like most things in this world, it wasn't one thing specifically that caused the franchise to decline, but rather a combination of things. Specifically a lack of focus on the story from sequel to sequel, and instead relying more on gimmicks as a way to tell new stories, an overemphasis on new characters, and getting way too outlandish with a series that started off grounded pretty firmly in reality. Or at least, as close to reality as a series about talking animals could get anyway. But the point is, all of this simply goes to show how not only was the writing getting worse with each passing installment, but that the series had unfortunately long run its course. Maybe they'll finally be able to turn things around in 6, but for some reason I highly doubt it. Alright, I think that's everything I had to say on that. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe it was a combination of different factors that led to the decline of the Ice Age franchise? Or do you think it was simply bad writing and that nothing else had to do with it? Please let me know in the comments below. But please keep in mind that you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video if you don't want to. You can feel about this or any other topic we discuss here however you want to, and if you think I had it all wrong, that's perfectly okay. And thank you all for watching. It is all greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.